Hi, and welcome to the Polite Soceity Podcast interview segment. We're doing this live from Mag 40 in beautiful, Del Rapids, actually, South Dakota. Massad Ayoob, Gail Pepner with us. Matt with Geeks, Gadgets, and Guns is here. Heinrich is running the camera for those of you who are watching on YouTube. We're going to be doing a couple segments here with Mass and Gail. First of all, I want to thank you two for, once again this year, bringing cool weather with you when you showed up.
People from Florida don't usually bring cool weather.
Last year when you guys were here, we actually were in a cold snap in May. And I thought you two might suffer from hypothermia coming from, but we've got beautiful highs of 75. It's just been gorgeous weather so far.
It has been.
It's been perfect.
So, Matt, you had a question you wanted to ask. I'll let you fire off.
All right, Mass. Since I went through Mag 40 with you last year, I think you had a really interesting discussion. After what happened a year ago with Philandro Castile, how would you suggest most people interact with the police if they're, say, pulled over on the side of the road?
Sure. Well, first off, as soon as you see those red, blue, or red and blue lights in the rearview mirror, pull over. You wouldn't believe how many people just keep going. We know they saw us. You do realize when you look in that rearview mirror, the person in the car behind you is making direct eye contact with your reflection. We know you saw us. And when you keep going and we finally get you pulled over and we ask, why didn't you stop? The answer is always, I thought you wanted the guy in front of me. It's you. He wants you. If he didn't want to pull you over, if he wanted the guy in front of you, he would have pulled up behind him and turned on the lights. But picture how that affects the mind of the officer. Now, one thing we learned from the Philandro Castile case, what Castile could not have known was that he fit the description of a man wanted for an armed robbery. So the officer was on a state of extremely high alert. He had called back up, and that's why you saw the second officer present in the dash cam videos. When the officer approaches your vehicle, have your hands in plain sight, not flat on the windshield. That's a position we'll order you into if it's a felony stop because we believe you're armed and dangerous. And if we see you do that of your own volition, that tells us you've had some interesting life experiences that you associate with police, and we will go to a higher level of alert. I suggest leaving the hands just relaxed on the steering wheel. As you're pulling over, don't start reaching for driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance. As the hand goes toward the wallet, toward the pocket, toward the glove box, think what that looks like to the person in the vehicle behind you. It looks like you're either trying to access a weapon or you're trying to hide some contraband object or substance. Now, the officer is going to ask you for license and registration. Be able to reach all of those without revealing a firearm. Okay, do not put the automobile registration under the 45 in the glove box. You don't need me to tell you where that's going to go. If your hand is going to come anywhere near the gun you're carrying, if the officer asks me for license and registration, I'd leave my hands on the steering wheel. I'd say, certainly, officer, however, I'm licensed to carry. I do have it on, and it's on my right hip. And to reach my wallet in my left hip pocket, I'm going to have to reach down toward my right hip to unbuckle the seatbelt. Tell me what you want me to do, and take it from there. The officer will generally tell you, move very slowly, do not touch the gun. Take the stuff out, hand it to him. Now, some states require you to notify a police officer if you're carrying a firearm when you have any official contact with them, which this, of course, is. Some do not. If you're traveling interstate, most of us have not been able to memorize every detail of all 50 states' laws and regs. So your best bet is to go on the assumption that notification is required. The best bet is to keep the concealed carry permit right next to the driver's license, hand it over with the license, the reg, and all that to the officer. Make every movement slow. Use your fingertips as much as possible instead of burying the hand in glove box, pocket, undercoat, etc. And one other thing we learned from the Philandro Castile case, if the officer tells you, don't pull it out, don't pull it out. Keep your hands where you can see them. I'm sure most of your listeners have seen the videotape from the dash cam of the actual shooting, and you can see how quickly the situation escalated. When Castile said that he had a firearm, the officer said, "Fine, just don't touch it," or words to that effect. You see his hand go proactively toward the holstered Glock. Then suddenly everything changes. Okay, you see the officer draw the gun, the voice goes up in both pitch and volume, and he yells, "Don't pull it out, don't pull it out." The shots are fired. His testimony was he was continuing to pull it out. He saw what he perceived to be the slide of a black semi-automatic pistol coming out of the right side pocket, and that's when he opened fire. The black semi-automatic pistol was found in the right front pocket of Philandro Castile's pants.
Now, that's one thing I did kind of think after the fact. A lot of us do motion without thinking about it. So maybe when you start hearing an officer say stop, do an assessment. What are my hands doing? Are they moving? Just maybe another thought to add a little bit of context in these cases to go, just be on the safe side and do...
Listen to what the officer is saying. Follow the commands. If you don't like it, that's fine. You can make a complaint later to Internal Affairs. You'll be able to find an attorney who will file a lawsuit for you. You don't want to die in the front seat of that car by mimicking someone who's attempting to murder a police officer.
All right, we've got a question from the audience.
Mass, I'm planning to travel down south, going through California with my family in a couple of months. Just want some tips on how to not become an accidental criminal carrying my Glock on that trip.
Sure. First, you're going to a 10-round state, and they take that very seriously. It's not 10 rounds in your 17-round Glock magazine. It's a magazine that cannot possibly hold more than 10 cartridges. Make sure that if you're taking a long gun, that it's not in violation of the California laws against so-called assault weapons. Anytime you're in doubt, follow FOPA, the Firearms Owners Protection Act. Goes back to 1986, also known as the McClure-Volkmer Act. If the gun is unloaded in a locked container, separate from ammunition, which is also ideally to dot all the I's and cross all the T's, in a separate locked container, out of reach of you, the driver, or you, the passenger. That is the farthest back corner of the SUV, some locking compartment in the pickup truck, or the trunk of the sedan. You will be in compliance with federal law, and you will not be out of compliance with Florida law, with California law. Basically, we are a 50-piece patchwork quilt of different gun laws. They are changing constantly in terms of local laws being passed, often in reaction to high-profile shootings. We saw how much legislation came out of the Sandy Hook atrocity. You might be, particularly in California, in a jurisdiction where there is a city ordinance against hollow point ammunition, for example, Sunnyvale or San Francisco. In my case, I would be inclined to stay out of Sunnyvale and San Francisco. And to stay on top of all of that, your best bet is handgunlaw.us. Gary Slider and his team there are in constant contact with the different state attorneys general, the different pro-gun groups, people keeping track of local ordinances and that sort of thing. And consult that anytime you're about to cross a state line. Ignorance is no excuse in the eyes of the law. That's something we all learn as children. And it is unfortunately absolutely true. And bear in mind, tell your elected representatives in Washington, support H.R. 38, national reciprocity for concealed carry. Your concealed carry permit should be as recognized as your driver's license and your marriage license.
Thank you. First off, let me say it's an honor and a privilege to be under your training this week.
Kind of you to say, brother, and thank you for your service in law enforcement.
Thank you. My question is, since it appears to me that the majority of the carry permit holders attend training because it's required by the state. And we're seeing more constitutional carry. Do you see any unintended consequences for these firearms carriers? And where do you see the carry training field going in the future?
Big question. It's going to take a little while to answer. Carl Wren's research in Texas indicates that only 1% of concealed carry permit holders will go beyond the minimum mandatory requirement in terms of their training. If you had asked me 30 years ago, I would have said, look, we'll give you national concealed carry in return for a training and qualification requirement. I would have said, you know what, that makes sense. Over the years, I have seen so many people who are able to save their life with a gun that could not have afforded when going back to the late 1980s when Florida went from may issue and it was only good for the county to shall issue good statewide. They put in a simple requirement of 4 hours of training that could also be met with a DD-214 or some other things. But the permit itself initially cost $167. And there were a whole lot of people who simply could not afford that. Now, if we put in a requirement that says you've got to have had 40 hours of training, I'm in the training business, and I can tell you two things. Few people would benefit from that minimum mandatory requirement more than I would, and a hell of a lot of people would not be able to make it and would be rendered helpless. Now, we've known with so many states from New York to New Hampshire where the permit was issued with no training requirement, to Vermont, which in the memory of every living American has never required a permit. Whenever I hear constitutional carry, I think Vermont model. And then you look at New Hampshire as one of the lowest crime states that there is. In the state of Vermont, probably more years than any other state, it has come in the lowest crime rate per capita. That tells me that we can trust our fellow responsible citizens. There's no requirement for training to buy a chainsaw. Okay, there's no requirement for training to buy a bicycle. But Americans tend to be smart enough to learn how to use the machine before they get out there using it. And we see very little abuse. And I've got to say, theory facing fact and history triumph. And while I would strongly recommend training, I enthusiastically recommend training, I can no longer justify a mandatory training requirement for a concealed carry.
All right, we're coming up on the end of the segment. We're going to go ahead and step aside to break. We've got one more segment with Massad Ayoob and Gail Pepin, and we'll be back with that right after this. Hey, and welcome back to the interview segment of the Polite Soceity Podcast, powered by the Firearms Policy Coalition. Back with Gail Pepin. We're going to announce it in that order. Gail Pepin and Massad Ayoob. We're at the Mag 40 here in Del Rapids, South Dakota. And we're going to go straight to another question from the audience. This one actually comes from one of our writers who's not yet been on the air, but his initial appearance on the air. Craig, what's your question?
Thanks, Paul. Hi, Gail. What would you say is the most common challenge facing women who want to start concealed carry?
I think there's a lot of challenges for women, and on the other hand, not as many as there used to be. A lot of women haven't grown up around guns. A lot of men have. Just the familiarity. And, they don't know what they need, what they want. They go to the gun shop. They can get steered the wrong direction, steered to the wrong gun by some old stereotypes and some old kind of thinking. But luckily nowadays there's some women's guns groups that are nationwide where women can get together with other women. And I've been to some of these groups and they are just awesome. They have so much fun. So they get together, they have a monthly or a weekly meeting and they shoot. And they go to training and they have national conferences. And so I think it's changing a lot. There's a lot more out there for women as far as holsters and gear. A couple of years ago, a lot of companies realized that women were the biggest growing gun owners, and they kind of went with this shrink it and pink it philosophy. But luckily, that seems to be passing. And they're coming out with good guns, much more usable for women, because we're not just, smaller versions of you. We have different needs, we have different strengths, and different weaknesses. So I think it's improving. Sometimes it's a guy thing, and they get hung up with all the nomenclature and all the terminology. They don't know what you know, and they don't know all the terminology. They don't know how to take them apart. They don't know how to clean them. They need someone to show them that. And these women's groups are great for that, too.
And I think that's true. I think, as a guy, you grow up, your dad shows you how to change the brakes on the car, change the oil, do those kind of things. And the girls don't get that kind of training in the family growing up, so they're not familiar with mechanical objects.
And parents should do that. I had my daughter bleeding my brakes when she was about 8 years old.
There you go.
She couldn't even reach the pedals, but I was like, okay, push, let go. So you need to teach your girls those things. You need to teach your boys how to cook and clean. You need to teach your girls mechanical stuff.
If I could have a follow-up question on that subject, and actually for both of you, because you're both, I'm sure, would have seen it. One thing I've seen as a host, and it's happened several times, is a husband and wife will come into training, and they'll both have the same exact gun.
It's usually a .40 caliber.
Really? Okay. And is that fairly common, or is that something? It's just something I see where the woman says it's a combination of the man knows what gun's best for him, and the woman says, "Just give me what you got," or is it the choice of the or is it about even, or is it the guy says you need this, or about even, or what do you think?
I think it's both. We see it a lot with women. I was making a joke. It was usually a .40 caliber, but it really usually is, because he picked it out and he did all the research, and this was the big manly tough gun, and here, you can shoot this too. I chose the best gun for us.
Uh-huh.
Well, it doesn't always work that way. 9mm is so much easier to shoot than .40 caliber, and ballistically it's not that different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, honestly, it really isn't. It'll get the job done.
Mm-hmm.
So, let the woman choose her own gun. It may not be the same thing. Like I said before, our needs are different, our bodies are different,
Mm-hmm.
and our gun choices should be different. They should be up to us, not up to a husband.
Yeah, speaking for Susan, Susan, her primary gun is a Smith & Wesson Shield. My backup is a Shield. I prefer the full-size Glock. She shoots 90mm, I shoot .40. It's for us, it's what's best for each individually. I think that's the way it should be for everybody.
I think so. Mass and I, sometimes we have the same gun, sometimes we have similar guns, sometimes they're totally different. Right now I have a Glock and he has a revolver. So, but we kind of go all different ways when it comes to our guns, so we're probably not the best example.
We have another question coming up from the audience. When you ask your question, get right up to the mic.
Hello. First, I want to say thank you guys for coming up and teaching this course. It's been a blast. Again, drinking from the proverbial fire hose is very true for this class. My question is for Gail. What do you do if you have a significant other that doesn't want anything at all to do with firearms? Is there any way to ease in, at least open mind, or whatever? Just kind of curious.
That's a difficult one. Maybe you need to find out why the significant other doesn't want anything to do with firearms. I know maybe they're afraid. Maybe they had a bad experience. Maybe they experienced a shooting. Maybe a relative was hurt with a gun or something. You never know. So you need to get to the bottom of that and find out what it is. Maybe it's because you spend all your time with the guys shooting guns, and maybe you're cleaning your guns on your nice dining room table and messing up her tablecloth. So find out what the real reason is, and then you can kind of go from there and figure out.
You mean I'm not supposed to be cleaning my guns on my wife's nice tablecloth?
No, back porch only.
But then again, you can also do things that helps if she has friends who are into shooting. That always helps as well.
That's where those women's groups come in.
Yeah, I'm still hoping that some of my sister's friends will finally get her to actually change her mind. To actually go, hey, maybe I should learn how to at least tell if this gun is safe. Be able to unload and clear a weapon. But then again, It's one of those institutional things where sometimes it's just in the family where, hey, the mother doesn't like guns all that much, so the daughter's not going to like guns that much. Never something thought about, just that's how it is.
You mean you haven't been able to convince your own sister?
Oh, no. If I try, things will go badly. Mainly because, well, she's more stubborn than me. Or at least as stubborn.
Oh, that whole sibling thing. Mass?
Basically, what Gail said, a lot of it is the cultural predispositioning. You know, the boys are frogs, snails, puppy dog tails. The girls are sugar and spice and everything nice. And the media and really a lot of the politicians have made the gun kind of an icon of male violence. If you read Susan Brownmiller's otherwise excellent book, Against Our Will, it's probably one of the best treatises on the psychology and the history of crime of rape that's ever been written. And then she gets into the self-defense recommendations, and she says, but never pick up the gun, because the gun is the very symbol of male violence, and it will be a surrender to violence. And I honestly threw the damn book across the room. We have to break through those stereotypes of, you know, the gun being associated with males simply because historically in the past that had been the case. If you look at the history of the women's rights movement, particularly of women entering previously male-dominated job markets, it has been a history of using mechanical devices to overcome disparity in upper body strength. The gun is a classic example of that. Now, it seems to me that the whole anti-gun thing is like the last vestige of the Susie housewife mentality that everyone mocked during the days when they called it women's liberation. Okay, look, you vote. You may be more politically active than your husband. If anybody said to you, oh, no, you can't touch the checkbook, that's a man's job, you'd smack them. But yet, when people say, ooh, the gun is a male icon and we're surrendering if we pick it up, the damn thing is a force multiplier. In the same sense that women got into well-paying construction jobs at the hydraulically operated controls of machines like forklifts and Caterpillar tractors. The force multiplier of the gun and of the lesser force weapons was what allowed females in law enforcement beginning circa 1970 to step out of the old paradigm of being the matron in her cute little stewardess-looking uniform and to become not only a fully empowered but a fully functional law enforcement officer. And I swear to God, that's why I call it the last vestige of the Susie housewife mentality. Okay, the picking up the gun to protect your family is kind of the final step in empowerment and individuality.
Did that help at all?
That did help a little. It gives me a few ideas on where I need to go from here. So, thank you.
The only thing I could add would be people like Gail. Introduce her to feminine role models. You know, the public thinks you have to be Annie Oakley to pick up the gun or something like that. And there's nothing unfeminine about strength. It's simply one more extension of independence and empowerment. But they need to see other women doing it because they're not going to hear it from old fat white guys and keep the ears open.
And there's plenty of us out there besides the women's groups. There's books. There's Kathy Jackson's website, The Corner Cat, is very good for women. And it's pink and it's got lace on it and it's got a lot of really good information. There's some really good Facebook groups that she could join. Women Carry is one of them.
If I could jump in, and I'm amazed you haven't brought this up yet. Gail's podcast, every once in a while, has something she calls a broadcast. Now, I want you to tell everybody what your theory is about that. And Craig, is he still here? And then we'll tell a little bit about Craig.
Okay, the broadcast is an occasional offshoot we do of the Proarms Podcast. I call it the Proarms Broadcast, where we throw out all the boys. And I talk to women in the industry. I talk to women shooters. I talk to women police officers. I talk to women publishers. Anybody who has to do with anything. Women trainers. I've had a lot of the big names on there, a lot of people you would recognize. So my theory originally, I may have to amend this theory now. My theory originally was you would put it on your iPod and go in your car and play it, trap your wife in the car, get far enough from home, and trap your wife and play it in the car. Well, one of our students here took that to heart too much and subjected his wife to 17 hours of gun podcasting. Don't do that much.
When she found out Gail was responsible, I thought she was going to strangle Gail.
But I try to make that female friendly, so it's not, maybe she thinks that we're a bunch of, like tough chicks, which we're not. We're just normal women, just like everybody else. We're moms, we're grandmas, we're nurses, we're teachers, we're just like everybody else.
All right. We do need to jump to break. Can I impose on you just one more segment with us?
Sure.
All right, we're going to step aside to break. We're going to have one more segment with Massad Ayoob, Gail Pepin, and we'll be back with that right after this. Hey, and welcome back to our final segment with Massad Ayoob, Gail Pepin on the Polite Soceity Podcast, powered by the Firearms Policy Coalition. We've got one more question from the audience. Go ahead, sir. Step up and get close to the mic as you speak.
This is another question for Mass. I was cued into one of your videos on YouTube the other day called Cute Lawyer Tricks. And as soon as I watched it, I'm like, this needs to be required viewing for anybody who carries a weapon. I was kind of curious. That's been a while since you've done that one. Are there any updates that you might have for that?
Oh, there are many, and you'll be getting them in the class. 1989 or 1990, I was teaching a lethal threat management for police course out in the Salt Lake City area. And they filmed the lecture I gave the officers on surviving cross-examination. It's a fairly broad area, and it probably doesn't lend itself to a 15-minute podcast. But the key thing is know where the attack on you is going to come and have the counter in place. If you've ever been in an argument with somebody and that night you woke up at 3 a.m., sat bolt upright and said, I should have said, it's going to be way too late when you're off the witness stand and you've had your last chance to tell your story. So try to put yourself, when you're being cross-examined, in the mind of the cross-examiner. Ask yourself every single question, not just every valid question that might be asked of you, but every BS question that might be asked by a truly desperate attorney who has no case. Ask yourself, what will my answer be? And have that ready to go.
I didn't know that one was up on YouTube also.
Yeah, it was actually pirated onto YouTube. That's why our current series is proprietary.
All right. Following back to a previous question, when we were talking about how only about 1% of gun owners get training, wasn't one of his conclusions that we should make classes smaller and shorter to get more people into them? Now, in these smaller classes, I know there's a local trainer in my area who does that kind of thing, and they seem to be getting good success. The flip side is they feel so unsafe in their own class, they normally wear body armor because the students just aren't safe. What would you suggest for a trainer who wants to make a nice, safe training environment?
Well, first, the conclusion that the more shorter classes are better came from Carl Wren. And what he was talking about was the fixed location instructor who is teaching primarily in that community. Gail and I are not into that. We're a traveling academy. We teach at an advanced level, and we're typically in a given venue once, maybe twice a year. For the local people, yeah, absolutely. It's a basic rule of adult education. It's really hard for folks to take a week out of their life, particularly if it's just for one member of the family. It's like, gee, I'm taking a separate vacation, folks. The heck with the rest of you. For the instructor in a fixed location, it makes perfect sense to do it like night school. One night a week or one Saturday or every other Saturday per month is much, much easier to manage. And it makes a lot of sense. We found over the years, it doesn't matter so much if you get lesson A, lesson B, lesson C, lesson D piecemeal, over a period of 4 weeks or maybe even 8 weeks or 4 months, as opposed to getting it all at once in an intensive immersion course like we teach. So a lot of that comes down to who do you have in your community that is teaching the programs, and do they have the curriculum that you want? But it will certainly make more of that training available to more ordinary people who have ordinary jobs, and travel is a special occasion instead of a daily, weekly, or monthly occurrence.
I gotta say, just because it's a short class, it doesn't have to be an unsafe class. You can, if you're gonna do like 4-hour classes here and there, your first class better be an in-depth safety class. And then after that, your students can move on from there with a review every single time, just so they remember what your ground rules are.
Okay, well, why don't we go for a few of the ground rules you use to keep Mag 40 the preeminent training pretty much for anyone who carries a gun?
Well, basically, for our safety rules, we're extremely rigid. One violation, you are off the range for the day. You may observe, but no longer participate. You'll be back the next day on probation. All the range staff will be alerted. Keep an eye on this one. And if you have a second violation, you are out of the course with no refund. And I know that sounds harsh, but we're talking lethal weapons here. We're in a given week, we're going to launch somewhere between 10 and 20,000 rounds downrange. Enough to wipe out small communities if it was applied wrong. We can't sit here and wink and nudge somebody who's careless with a gun and crosses someone else. That tells us they're not safe, they're not ready to be out there carrying that, and our responsibility for the safety of everyone else there far exceeds any responsibility some lightweight yuppie might think we have for the self-image and the self-esteem of someone so egotistical they ignore the safety of people around them with lethal weapons.
I also want to say, man, if the class seems unsafe to you, you don't have to stay there. You're free to walk. And I don't care if you're going to be the one sticking out, or you're afraid you're going to hurt somebody's feelings, or you're not going to be, in your case, probably not macho enough because we're playing by big boy rules here. You know, screw the big boy rules. It's your butt who's going to get shot. And if they're that unsafe, they probably aren't going to help you out if you're in a situation like that. I attended an unsafe class once. It was a short class, and it was unsafe. And at the end of the class, we gave the instructor hell. And he's no longer an instructor for that group that I took the class from anyway. But after that class, I said, you know what? I'm not going to sit in this another unsafe class ever. If there's ever any unsafety, I'm walking my butt right out of there.
There's definitely something to be said for that. It just seems classes like this draws a far higher level of safety out of the students, because we are investing so much time into this class and so much money, and we want to make sure we get everything out of it possible, and we want to make sure we're safe. I mean, it's kind of the 1% thing. The 1% are going to be 100% safe 90% of the time.
Well, where Gail and I live, we have a strong relationship with a local group that does regular CCW. And partly just because they're friends and they can always use range officers, and partly because we do get to deal with folks like you. We get to deal with, often advanced students. We like to get back and every now and then maintain touch with the white belts. When you're teaching advanced stuff, it's real easy to concentrate on the black belts. And you forget the function of the black belt is, among other things, to teach the white belt. And if you haven't taught a white belt yourself in 10 years, you're going to lose that connection. And I've got to tell you, it's a whole lot more scary than what we do in our work. That said, we maybe should wear body armor for a few of them. But at this point, we do not. And the folks who run that particular course have trained with us. They're very safe. They have good rigid safety. I've got to say, with all the new people coming in for literally a 4-hour class, some of whom have not touched a gun before, it gives me my daily adrenaline requirement.
I gotta say, with range officers, with that class, we have to be like 2-to-1 and sometimes 1-to-1.
That's true. The newer the student is, the more direct individual supervision that they're going to need.
which is kind of also the downside of government requiring training, because then you have people trying to get all into the same class, because some states, especially the more rural, you might only have one trainer for 100 miles.
And when it's mandated, they're not necessarily that committed. Like somebody who's taking a Mag 80, it's optional.
Yeah.
You don't have to take it. You don't have to be here. You don't have to spend $800.
It's also the flip side. I mean, I know one state where there's apparently one guy that meets the training requirements by showing a 15-minute video, and since people have taken that, they now believe they never have to take any more training.
We have some people in our state who thinks that shooting one round of airsoft into his car trunk qualifies as firing a pistol.
Wow.
Wow, that's starting to sound like there.
He who shall not be named.
Yes. If I could
You
change,
mean Voldemort?
if I could change directions just a little bit, it was something I've always wanted to ask, and now that I've got you cornered and on air, one of the things you say one of the selling points to a Mag 40 is for graduates of the Mag 40, that they should become involved in a defensive gun use, and it is required that you would be an expert witness for them. How often has it happened, or has it yet happened, that you've had to go to a graduate and be an expert witness in court for them?
It's happened a few times. Fortunately, our graduates know how not to make the kind of mistakes that bring people in a court. So that right there narrows the field. We have not yet lost one. We've had over the years, I've been teaching for 45 years, started teaching cops in 1972, civilians in 81. We have had 3 of our students charged with murder. One of them was found guilty and is still doing life without parole. And significantly, he never called me for help. Another went completely off the deep end and murdered 3 people, and had the good grace to go out in the desert and eat his HK 9mm and become a self-resolving problem. And after those, we had people who said, well, my God, you've had 2 people who committed murder. How can you still teach civilians? And my answer was, excuse moi, these guys were both cops. You're going to tell me I can't train cops either? Our third one, who was charged with murder, and we haven't discussed this yet in our Mag 40 class, remind me to bring that up in the morning, is a fascinating case, and there's a lesson there. He was a police officer in New Orleans who had gone 3rd level with us, paying out of his own pocket for training. During Hurricane Katrina, he was involved in what I consider to be an absolutely justifiable shooting. He immediately radioed it in. The man he shot fled the scene, and dispatch said, yeah, that's fine, we'll get somebody there when we can. Basically, they were in the midst of something that had decimated the police force, and it was hours before a responding officer could get there. This guy wound up leaving the scene. His accomplice drove him away, and the guy subsequently died. For what I consider to be political reasons, he was later prosecuted for murder. The case was an absolute outrage. Now, my first awareness of it was when I got a subpoena from the U.S. Attorney's Office to speak as a witness for the prosecution against him. And I called the prosecutor, and it was kind of a whiskey tango foxtrot. And there was long discussion, and basically I made it abundantly clear, this is obviously, from everything you're showing me, excuse me, a justified homicide, and I'm telling you right now, I'm going to say that in front of the jury. Well, it was obvious from the beginning he was never going to call me. What he had done, he was a very, very clever guy. He's got a politically based prosecution going, and he knows this is a very defensible officer who's done the right thing. So he has reached out and proactively subpoenaed as a prosecution witness the people he thought would be coming in to speak for the defense. Well, I found out who the defense lawyer was. I called him, said, hey, here's the deal. And that lawyer was talking to me like he was the Pope and I was Satan risen in the Vatican. Someone he's already seen on the list as the prosecution's witness is now calling him. And he didn't trust me, he didn't take a word. He did wind up hiring an expert witness who spoke at trial and said all the right things. Unfortunately, the witness he had hired was one of these guys that had the fake diploma mill PhD, and that came out at trial, and the jury instantly disregarded him. The officer was convicted and did time in prison. It was an absolutely wrongful conviction, in my opinion. He was subsequently exonerated on appeal. It was remanded for a new trial, and he won acquittal in the new trial. Predictably, again, the defense attorney did not call someone who had been named as a witness for the prosecution. So my advice to you is, if you are involved in a shooting, have your attorney immediately call every instructor who has ever trained you. Put them on your witness list up front and keep the other side from using that dirty shyster trick to keep the people who keep off the stand, the people's whose material testimony would have been, this man did exactly what we trained him to do. What he did and what he was trained to do was exactly the right thing to do. The other side was, I can't say they were good enough attorneys, that's not the right word. They were certainly sharp and skillful enough attorneys to use that trick to shortstop the people who could have testified for the officer and kept him out of prison in the first place.
Well, we are rapidly coming up on the end of the final segment. Before we take off, I want to take just a second for the listeners of my show and for those who may catch us on YouTube. For those of you who know my story, I was involved in an incident in February of last year. February, actually, of 2016 in Nebraska. I spent a week in jail. And through social media, it got out what was going on. And a whole bunch of people reached out to my wife. I'm proud to say that I had to make several phone calls when I got out of jail. The first one was to my boss, but the second one was to Massad Ayoob, who was gracious enough when he found out what was going on. Gail and Mass got on the phone to my wife, Susan, and let them know that they were there for her. And for you to do that for a graduate of your program speaks volumes to me for your integrity. And I want to thank you for that.
Brother, here's the deal. Early on, I remember in the 1970s, a friend of mine in another police department became involved in a controversial shooting. He had done exactly what he was taught to do at one of the major private academies. He had reached out to that academy to say, hey, can you come and testify that I did what you taught me to do? And they said, we don't get involved in that sort of thing. I was not yet, I didn't get into private training till 1981. Prior to that, it was institutional. And I remember thinking then, this is utterly wrong. Utterly wrong. If that guy has done what you taught him to do, my God, how can you look yourself in the mirror and not go and say, you're damn right he did what I taught him, and here is why what I taught him was the right thing to do. And that's why it's no charge for any of my graduates. There are two guys who didn't call for very good reason, and we've already discussed them. And I would have had to go in and say, yeah, the damn idiot committed murder, and, gee, maybe I'll send him a Christmas card in prison. But basically, if they've done the right thing, you should stand behind them. That officer in New Orleans, I told the defense attorney when I called him, I said, aren't you going to have what he did is within department regs. Aren't you going to have your department instructors come in and speak? They said, we asked. They said they wouldn't. I said, subpoena them, for God's sake. He said, I talked to one of them. He said, if you subpoena me, I'll tell you I don't remember a goddamn thing.
Wow. That's amazing. Well, we are, and I apologize. We are actually over on the segment, but again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming and doing the training here. And everybody, if you can get to wherever Massad Ayoob is instructing Mag 40, if you're a Mag 40 graduate, good, get to a Mag 80 or beyond. But I cannot recommend this training highly enough. You say yourself, it is a minor on how to shoot and a major on when to shoot. And if you carry a gun, Matt, I'm sure you'd agree with it. If somebody carries a gun, they need to go through this training.
This class is absolutely 100%. Put it to the top of your list, because just the legal half alone is worth the cost of admission times 10.
Absolutely. Well, we do have to jump aside to break. When we come back, we've got our defensive gun use segment, and we'll get to that right after this.